Hello and welcome back to another update as we cover the latest developments in the Avdiivka front in the Russo-Ukrainian war, where we see that the Russians have managed to capture major parts of the Ukrainian fortifications here to the southeast of Avdiivka. We see that there is this final section that is yet to be under Russian control. This is the Dacha area here to the south of Avdiivka, with multiple trenches going through and heavy fortifications throughout. What we saw is that over the past previous days, we saw the Russians launching some small assaults on the Ukrainian positions here to the southeast, getting a foothold in the trenches towards those positions and diverting some of the Ukrainian forces in that direction to attempt to weaken the western parts, and weaken them they did, as they subsequently launched assaults throughout the late hours of the day and managed to capture multiple fortifications and trenches all throughout this southern part. And they also launched an operation in the direction of Bakhmut, which they haven't done in quite a while. So with this, we're seeing that the Russian plan here is clearly to launch a major push here in the west while distracting the Ukrainians here in the east to divert their forces to this concentrated area. Now we're seeing that the main push is taking place here towards Bakhmut, which, if the Russians manage to capture it, is the final outpost of the Ukrainians here to the south of Avdiivka. After this, their focus will divert to what they originally attacked, and that is the Dacha area here to the south of Avdiivka. And if they manage to capture that as well, they will have all of the fortifications down south of Avdiivka in their hands, and they will have a foothold within Avdiivka, allowing them to then launch major operations into Avdiivka, similar to the start of the Battle of Bakhmut, where the Wagner forces here in the very eastern outskirts of Bakhmut started gaining a foothold in the industrial zone. That is the industrial zone here down south by Avdiivka, where we see that the Russian forces managed to take control of this, which included some Wagner forces here as well. But since then, they also managed to get a foothold in the residential area, where if we take a look in the Bakhmut direction, that corresponds to this area right here. So with that, we see that the Russians now are going to force a breakthrough through those residential areas to launch attacks in multiple directions and expand their zone of control. So what we're likely going to see is that while the battle on the outskirts, on the flanks of Avdiivka continue, we'll see that the Russians will also subsequently launch attacks here to expand their zone of control within the residential area, gain control over further streets, and expand it in a southern direction to allow the Russians here in the south of the city to also get a foothold within the city. All of this would be stage 2 of the operation, where the stage 1 was getting the foothold and getting control over the industrial zone. After this, we'll see that the Russians will gain a proper foothold within the south of the city, and we'll also likely see more operations here to the north to finally capture all of the Dacha areas, storming the Avdiivka coke plant and getting a foothold within the residential area here to the north. We will also likely see further operations here to the south of Kamyanka, getting control over the Dacha area here to the south and southwest of that, which will lead to the third stage, which is the general assault on the city itself. This is similar as well to the direction of Bakhmut. This is pretty much the playbook of what happened in Bakhmut, and that is the fighting on the flanks taking place, which are the main fights, and then the storming towards the city itself, where they slowly expanded into multiple directions. But the main point is also that they entered from multiple directions, in the northern direction towards Yahidne, northeastern parts, as well as the eastern parts, and in the southern parts by Upitne, moving in the northern direction. So we'll likely see that the Russians again will attack from multiple directions and gain multiple footholds within the city to spread out the Ukrainian forces within it. And then we also saw in the direction of Bakhmut that they all went into the same direction. They went into the center of the city before moving in a westward direction towards the citadel area. And that is the fourth stage, which is as soon as the Russians have a foothold throughout the city of Avdiivka in the southern and eastern parts, as well as the northern parts, they will then focus on the Avdiivka coke plant and move us in a central position from all three directions, all attacking the same part, before moving on to the citadel area. Avdiivka itself is a smaller city than Bakhmut. The difference is that this is a very much longer city, and at the same time the citadel area is much smaller. Therefore, the Russians attacking within the city will likely all be in the view of the citadel area. So they may change the strategy in that sense, that they may launch attacks towards the citadel area itself. This would likely be met with fierce resistance, as the Ukrainians have large minefields all the way around the citadel area, especially since one of the main supply routes goes through the north of the citadel area. So we'll also likely see Russian attempts by the flanks to capture Severne and Tonenke at some point nearby. We also see that the fighting in Stepova and Berdishi will likely also continue until the Russians gain control of those, after which the fighting will switch completely to the Avdiivka coke plant, similar to the north of Bakhmut, where we here see that there is this industrial zone here to the north of Bakhmut. And when the Russians focused on that, it didn't take much. It took about 2 weeks, despite the underground tunnels within the industrial area, that the Russians or Wagner forces took control of it. But after the control of it, they solidified their foothold within Bakhmut, and there was no chance of the Ukrainians reversing the situation. And that is the same with the Avdiivka coke plant. If the Russians captured the Avdiivka coke plant, even if the Ukrainians launched a counterattack, they wouldn't be able to stop the Russian offensive, and it would only be a matter of time before Avdiivka completely falls. There are two possibilities in this situation. Either the Russians will continue pressuring the flanks and launch multiple offensives in these directions, which will cause more casualties, but at the same time will be more effective in capturing the city itself, as Avdiivka is clearly running low on both ammunition and manpower. This has been reported by both Russian and Ukrainian sources, claiming that the Ukrainian casualties in the area have been high, while the possibility of rotation and resupply of the city has been very low due to the Russian pressure on the flanks. Therefore, the manpower and the supplies within the city are very low, which is why the Russians have been able to push through this heavily fortified area, despite them being so heavily fortified, because the Ukrainians simply do not have enough manpower and firepower to hold them. Therefore, we're seeing that Avdiivka itself is running low on supplies and manpower, while the western villages around are likely not, because it's much easier to resupply those areas in comparison, because they don't have to drive through a road that is just 2.3 kilometers from the front. Even if we say the southern part, we see here that it is clearly also very close to the front, 1.9 kilometers. So we're seeing that the distance between the front line and the supply roads are very short, and there's likely going to be direct fire towards those positions. Although with the Avdiivka coke plant still under the Ukrainian control, they still have a large possibility of actually dealing with the Russians and resupplying, even if just a bit, towards the city, but definitely not enough to continue fighting, which is why we saw this Russian armored assault going through and not even getting shot at here in the northeast by the Kamyanka direction. While the fighting continues in this state, we have this article by CNN where they talk about how the situation on the battlefield is static, and throughout 2024 they do not believe that there's going to be much movement, as the Ukrainians will not be able to launch their own offensive and the Russians will likely not succeed. Of course, this is a Western article, so they are pro-Ukrainian, so there is this bias. We even see that they have this top-tier shovel, allowing them to have proper positioning, and this is likely why the CNN article is so optimistic, because with this tier shovel, it is likely that the Russians will have a difficult time advancing. But the point of this article is all eyes on 2025, because they do not believe that the Ukrainians will have enough forces to launch a counterattack or a new offensive before 2025, if the funding in 2024 even continues. If the funding continues, they'll be able to fight in 2025. If not, then 2024 will likely just be the last year where they have any sort of offensive capabilities. At the same time, the Russians are continuously building up. So the requirements for the Ukrainians to even be able to launch an offensive on 2025 would be for continuous funding, and at the same time for them to be able to grind down the Russian forces enough that their own buildup overgrows or outgrows the Russian growth. So they need to inflict a lot of casualties on the Russians, and at the same time they need to build up a large force. This cannot be done without Western funding and a significant increase in Western funding. And at the same time, the Western sanctions on Russia really needs to pick up its speed, its efficiency, because at this rate, the Russians will still outproduce even with significant funding from the West. And therefore, it is unlikely that the Ukrainians will launch a new offensive. And even if they do, what likelihood is it that it will be stronger than the Robotyne one here in the 2023 summer offensive? Who knows what will happen? But what I can say is that the Ukrainians definitely need a lot more support if that is going to happen. And so far, the EU and the US have not agreed on any new aid packages. But as you can see, the Battle of Avdiivka is entering into a new stage. It is likely far from over, but there is this unknown factor, which is how many Ukrainian soldiers are within the city, how much ammunition and supplies do they have left, how many Russian soldiers are attacking. According to the latest reports, they have rotated in a lot of troops. Therefore, it is likely that they significantly outnumber the Ukrainians defending the city, and therefore we're going to see more advances by the Russians soon, according to that fact. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching, and have a great day.